3 days. That's how long a man can sit on a porch without eating, without sleeping, without saying a single word out loud, because the only voice he ever wanted to answer is gone, and the silence she left behind is louder than any storm. I know because I was that man. I had a rifle by the door and a grave under the cottonwood, and I had made up my mind about a great many dark things in those 3 days. I thought nothing left in the world could reach me anymore. I thought wrong. Because on the morning of the 4th day, 2 strangers walked out of the desert, a woman who wasn't supposed to be there and a boy no taller than my hip. And that boy asked me one question, 4 words, the simplest thing in the world. And it broke something open in me that I'd been holding shut with both hands. If you've ever lost someone, if you've ever sat in a quiet house and not known how you were supposed to keep breathing, stay with me. Because this story isn't about how I lost her. It's about how a child I'd been raised to fear handed me back a reason to stand up. This is the story of 3 days of heartbreak, and the 4 words that changed everything. Stay till the end. The last thing that boy did, I've never told anyone until now. The coffee had gone cold in the cup, and I hadn't noticed until a fly landed on the rim and walked across the surface like it owned the place. That's the first thing I remember clear from the 4th day. Not grief. A fly. Funny what the mind grabs onto when it's done falling and it's just lying there at the bottom looking up. I'd been on the porch since before light. I'd been on the porch near enough since they put Marta in the ground 3 days back. I'd go in at night because the cold made me, and I'd lie on top of the quilt she'd stitched the first winter we owned the place, and I would not look at her side of the bed, and somewhere near dawn I'd give up the pretending and come back out and sit. There was a rhythm to it by then. A bad one, but a rhythm. I should tell you who I am so you know whose word you're taking. Name's Elias Cade. Folks called me Eli, the ones who called me anything. I ran a small spread in the high desert south of the Gila, 40-odd head of cattle on the years that were kind and half that on the years that weren't, and a windmill that screamed like a hurt thing every time the breeze swung north. I was 43 that spring. I had a habit of counting fence posts, breaths, the slats in the corral when my chest got tight, because numbers don't ask anything of you, they just sit there in a row and let you put your hand on them. And I whittled. Small things. Birds mostly, and the occasional dog with legs too short. Marta used to line them up on the windowsill and turn them all to face the same way, and I never once asked her why, and now I'd have given a year of my life to know. She died of a fever that came up out of nowhere, the way they do. Tuesday she was complaining about the price of nails. Friday she didn't know my face. Saturday the doctor from the settlement, who I'd ridden 11 hours to fetch, stood in my doorway with his hat in his hands and told me there wasn't a thing in his bag that was going to help. And I think I knew then that I'd left her alone for the last day she'd ever be in her right mind, and that I'd done it riding hard for a man with an empty bag. You carry things like that, you don't set them down. So the 4th day, the fly on the cold coffee. I'd been thinking, in a low, flat way that scared me even then, about how a man could just stop. Stop in the way you stop a clock. There was a great deal in the world I didn't want to be awake for anymore, and the rifle was right there by the door, and I want to be plain with you because plainness is the only thing I have to offer. I was not sitting on that porch because I had decided to live. I was sitting there because I hadn't yet decided the other thing, and a man can stretch out the not deciding for a long while if he's stubborn enough, and I have always been the most stubborn fool in any county I happen to be standing in. That's when I saw them. First it was just a wrongness on the flat, a shape that didn't belong, the way you notice a missing fence post before you can say what's off about the line. The morning light out there does strange things, lays the heat down in sheets so the ground looks like water, and at first I thought it was a deer come down off the ridge. Then the shape split into 2 shapes, one tall and one small, and they were coming straight on toward the well at the edge of my yard, slow. The way people walk when they have already walked a great deal further than their legs wanted to go. A woman and a child. I knew what they were before I could make out a feature. The cut of her, the way she moved, economical, no waste in it, eyes going to the high ground first and the low second. Apache. This was Apache country before it was anybody's, and the army had spent the better part of a decade trying to make it not, herding people onto a stretch of bad land up north that nobody who'd ever stood on it would have wished on a dog. There'd been trouble that spring. There was always trouble that spring. The talk in the settlement was all of bands gone off the reservation, of patrols, of bounties. Some of the ranchers up the valley were said to be paying out of their own pockets for trouble brought to a permanent stop. And here was the trouble itself, walking up to my well with a little boy stumbling at her hip, both of them gray to the knee with dust. I want to tell you I felt something noble. I didn't. I felt the old fear go through me, cold and automatic, the fear I'd been handed as a boy by men who'd been handed it by men before them, and my hand was halfway to the door and the rifle behind it before my mind had finished forming a single clear thought. That's the truth of it. 3 days of wanting to die, and the body still jumps to keep itself alive. We're built contrary all the way down. But I didn't reach the rifle, because the woman stopped. She stopped a good 30 paces out in the open where I could see both her hands, and she did a thing I have turned over in my head every day since. She put one hand flat on the boy's chest, easing him back behind her hip, and she raised the other, empty, palm out, and she just stood there, not pleading. I want to be clear about that because it matters. There was no pleas in it. It was the look of someone laying her cards on the table because she has done the arithmetic and there is nothing left to do but play the hand. She was telling me, I see your door. I see what's behind it. I have a child. Decide. We stood like that, the two of us, across 30 paces of dirt, for what felt like a long while and was probably the length of 10 or 12 breaths. I counted them. Of course I counted them. It was the boy who broke it. He'd been hidden mostly behind her, but children are children in every nation under the sun, and a child who has been walking through a furnace since before dawn and sees a well does not have it in him to stand still and be diplomatic. He ducked out from behind her leg and went for the water, and she caught his shoulder, but gently, and too late to be a real catch, more a reminder. And he looked up at me with the whole of his small face, and what was in it was not fear and was not cunning. It was thirst, plain animal thirst, and under it something worse. The particular exhaustion of a child who has been frightened so long he's run clean out of the energy to be frightened, and is just tired now, tired down to the bone, the way no child should ever have cause to be. I have buried a wife. I had been 3 days deciding whether to keep walking around in my own skin. And it was that, a thirsty boy too worn out to be scared of me, that put the first crack in the wall. There's a dipper, I said. My own voice startled me. It came out rusted, the words barely fitting together because I had not used it in 3 days except to say things to a grave that the grave did not answer. By the trough, it's clean. The woman didn't move. She watched my mouth, and I understood she had little or no English, that the words were just sounds to her, but she was reading me the way I'd read the flat looking for the wrongness, the missing post. Whatever she found in my face must have passed, because she gave the boy a small push between the shoulder blades, and he went to the trough at a run that turned into a stagger, and he drank like the water was air and he'd been drowning in the wrong direction. She did not drink. She stood and watched me, between the boy and the door, until he was done. Only then did she go to the trough, and even then she kept her body angled so she could see me the whole time. There is a kind of courage that has nothing to do with battle. It is the courage of standing between the thing you love and everything in the world that might want to hurt it, and not letting yourself sit down, not even when you're so tired your hands are shaking on the dipper. I knew that kind. I'd had it 3 days ago in a sick room, and I had failed at it, and watching her do it where I had not was a knife I had not expected and could not have refused. They didn't ask to come closer to the house. I didn't offer. The morning wore on and they rested in the thin shade of my well shed, and I sat on my porch, And for the first time in 3 days I was thinking about something that was not Marta and was not the rifle. I was thinking, they can't stay there. The shed faced the open flat. Anyone coming up the wash would see them from a mile off. And I knew, the way you know weather, that someone would be coming up the wash. People had been coming up that wash for 3 days. Neighbors with stew they'd set on the rail and not known what to say over. The preacher, twice. A man named Holloway from 2 spreads down, who'd lost his own wife the year before and so was the only one who'd sat with me without talking, which is the only thing that helped. And patrols. There'd been a cavalry patrol through not 4 days back, the morning before Marta took her turn for the worse, asking had I seen sign of anybody off the reservation. I'd said no, which had been true. It would not be true much longer. Around midday the boy fell asleep in the shade, just folded up sudden the way the very young do, and the woman let him, and she watched him sleep with an expression I'd warned myself looking at things I loved and was afraid of losing. And I made a decision, sitting there. It wasn't a grand one. I didn't stand up and declare anything. I just got up, and my knees cracked like a couple of dry sticks, and I went inside, and I came back out with bread and the better part of a side of bacon and the rest of the morning's coffee, still warm against odds in the pot, and I carried it down off the porch, slow, hands where she could see, the way she'd shown me without meaning to teach me anything, and I set it on a flat rock halfway between us, the way you'd feed something wild you didn't want to spook. Then I went back and sat down. She looked at the food a long time before she touched it. When she finally did, she woke the boy first and fed him before she fed herself, and it was watching that, a starving woman waking a child to put food in him before she'd take a crumb, that finished off whatever was left of the wall. Because Marta and I never had any. Children, I mean. We tried the early years and it didn't take, and then it took and didn't hold twice, and after the second one we stopped talking about it the way you stop poking a bad tooth, by silent agreement, and we'd built a whole life in the room around that silence. And I had thought in some buried place that this was the great grief of my life, the empty rooms, the windowsill of wooden birds with no small hands to play with them. I had not known a thing about grief. I learned it that week. And part of what I learned, watching a stranger wake her boy to feed him in the shade of my well shed, was that the grief I'd thought was the whole of me was just the first room of a house I was going to have to live in now, and there were more rooms, and some of them had people in them I hadn't met yet. The afternoon stretched long and gold. I whittled because my hands needed something. A bird, like always. And the boy, full now and rested, drifted closer in the slantwise way of children, pretending to look at the dog tracks in the dust, pretending to look at the windmill until he was near enough to watch my knife. He crouched a few feet off with his chin on his knees and watched the shavings curl off and fall, and his eyes followed every stroke, and his mother let him, though she didn't take her own eyes off me for 1 second of it. I held the finished bird out on my palm, a quail, more or less, one leg shorter than the other like all of them. He looked at it. He looked at his mother. She gave the smallest nod a person can give and still call it a nod. And he took it, careful, 2 fingers like it might fly, and he held it up to the light and turned it the way Marta used to turn them on the sill, and something happened in my chest that hurt worse than the fever days, because it was the first thing in 3 days that had felt like anything other than falling. That's when I heard it. Far off down the wash, where the sound carries on the evening air, the chink and thud of shod horses on hard ground, more than one, coming up slow and unhurried, the way men ride when they're hunting and in no particular rush, because they believe the thing they're hunting can't get away. The woman heard it the same instant I did. She was on her feet before I was, the boy snatched up against her, the wooden quail still clutched in his fist, her whole body turned to the sound and then turned to me. And there it was again across the dust between us, that same flat question from the morning, except now it had a price tag on it. Now it cost something. Now it was the only question that has ever really mattered between any 2 people on this earth. What are you going to do? I looked down the wash at the dust just starting to lift over the rise. I looked at the woman and the boy and the small carved bird in his hand. I thought about the rifle behind my door and what I'd nearly used it for that morning, and how strange it was that the world had sent me, on the very day I'd run out of reasons to stand up, two people whose lives now depended entirely on whether I would. It didn't matter that she had no English. Some words a body understands before the mind catches up, and the urgency in me must have carried, because she moved not toward the house at first, no, she moved between me and the wash, putting her body in the gap, reading the trap in it. Of course she did. A white man with a fast tongue, herding her and her son into an enclosed space the minute armed riders appear, what would you think? What would anyone with a brain and a child to keep think? So I did the only thing I could think to do. I turned my back on her. I turned my back deliberate, slow, and I walked to my own door and I picked up the rifle. I felt her go still as stone behind me when I did it, felt the whole flat hold its breath, and I carried it out past her and I set it down, on the rock. The same flat rock I'd set the bread on. I set my rifle down on it and I stepped back from it with my hands open and I looked at her and I tipped my head toward the house. Yours if you want it. I'm not the danger. The danger's coming up the wash. She looked at the rifle. She looked at me. And then she did the bravest thing I have ever seen a human being do before or since. She left the rifle where it was. She did not snatch it up. She made the harder bet that a man who'd hand over his only gun wasn't planning to need it on her, and she took her boy's hand and went into my house, into the dark of it, fast and low, and I heard the floorboards take their weight and then nothing. I had maybe 4 minutes. I want you to understand what I did next, and why, because for 3 days I had been a man who could not be moved off a porch, and now I was moving like a man half my age, and the difference was not courage. I want to kill that word right here. It was not courage. It was that I finally had something to do with my hands besides whittle birds nobody would ever play with. Grief had had me by the throat for 3 days because grief is what fills the space where there's nothing to do, and the second the world handed me a thing that needed doing, the grief had to make room. That's all. That's the whole secret of me if I have one. Give me a task and I'll walk through fire. Take it away and I'll sit on a porch and rot. I scuffed out their tracks from the well to the shed with a cottonwood branch, fast, sloppy, then better, working backward. I tipped the trough's overflow so the wet dirt looked like I'd watered stock. I put the rifle back behind my door. A man with no rifle in this country is a man with something to hide. I took the second coffee cup off the rock and threw the dregs and set it inside. And then I sat back down on the porch with my cold cup and my knife and a half-shaped piece of cottonwood, and I made my hands be still, which was the hardest part of all of it, harder than the running, and I waited. 3 of them came up over the rise. Not army. That was the first thing, and it didn't make me easier. Army men have rules they mostly half keep. These were settlement men, 2 I knew by sight and 1 I didn't, and the one in front was a rancher named Prout who ran a big outfit up the valley and had a mouth on him at every gathering about the Apache question, as he called it. Like it was arithmetic, and he was the only one who could add. They had rifles across their saddle bows, and they had that loose, pleased looseness of men who are enjoying themselves and calling it duty. "Cade," Prout said, drawing up. He looked at me a beat too long. Word of Marta had gotten around. You could see him deciding whether to mention it and deciding not to bother. "You look like hell." "Buried my wife Saturday," I said, "so." Landed a little. The man I didn't know took his hat off. Prout didn't, but he had the grace to drop his eyes a second. "Heard that, sorry for it." Then business. "We're tracking a bunch come off the reservation. Buck and some others jumped the line up north, killed a teamster on the Bowie Road. We split off after sign of a couple that broke south. Woman looks like, and a young one." He leaned and spat. "You see anything, anybody at your well, they'd want water bad by now, country like this. And here is the morally heavy thing, the thing I'd been told to expect from God and the law both, the thing I have to set down honestly because the whole rest of my life turned on it. I did not even have to decide. I'd thought in the 4 minutes that I'd have to decide that the lie would catch in me, that I'd been raised a certain way, and the certain way would rise up and make me hesitate. It didn't. The lie came out of me smooth as creek water, and I have wondered since whether that should trouble me, that I lied to 3 armed men about a teamster's killers without my heart so much as skipping, and I have decided that it shouldn't, and here is why. Because I had spent 4 minutes in the company of that woman and that boy, and I had seen her wake him to feed him, and I had seen him hold a wooden bird up to the light, and no story Prout could tell me about a killing on the Bowie Road, a killing that might even have been true, was going to make me believe that the thirsty child in my house had cut down a teamster. They wanted the woman and the boy because the woman and the boy were the ones they'd found sign of, and a bounty doesn't ask the dead to prove what they did. Nobody's been by but the preacher, I said, and Holloway with stew. I looked at my cold coffee. Been quiet mostly. People let a man grieve. It was the last bit that did it. People let a man grieve. It put a small shame on them for being there at all. 3 days into my widowing, and I watched it work. Prout's jaw worked. The man without the hat fidgeted his reins. But the third one, the one I didn't know, was looking past me, at the porch rail, where I realized with a slow, cold drop in my gut, a single line of small, wet footprints had dried the boys from where he'd come up out of the trough and drifted near to watch me whittle before the riders came, before I'd thought to scuff anything. I'd cleaned the yard. I hadn't thought of the porch. The grief, maybe. The grief makes you stupid in the corners. The stranger opened his mouth, and the windmill screamed. The breeze had swung north, the way it did most evenings, and the windmill let out that long tearing shriek of dry metal it always did, and every horse in the yard threw its head, and Prout's mount sidestepped hard into the stranger's, and for a few seconds it was all cursing and raining, and the moment was simply gone, broke clean in half by a piece of machinery I'd been meaning to grease for 2 years, and thank God in his heaven I never had. Christ Cade fixed that thing, Prout snapped, hauling his horse around. On the list, I said. They lingered another minute, but the spell of it was broken, and grief had made them uneasy, and the windmill had made them eager to be gone, and the light was going, and the trail south of a creature that wants to be lost is a poor thing to follow in the dark. Prout told me to send word to his place if I saw anything, that there was money in it, said the word money looking right at my poor cracked windmill and my thin stock and my fresh grave, like he was doing me a kindness pointing out the price of my neighbors' lives. I said I would. I have never in my life meant a thing less. They rode out the way they'd come, and I sat on my porch with my heart going like a trip hammer now that there was no longer any use for it to be calm, and I watched the dust of them sink back down into the wash, and the flat go empty and gold and then gray. When I went inside, it was full dark in the house, and I didn't light the lamp in case. For a moment I thought they'd run, that she'd slipped out the back the second my voice changed, talking to Prout, taken the boy and gone, trusting nothing, which would have been the sensible thing. Then I heard breathing in the corner by the cold stove. 2 sets, the small one quick and the larger one slow, and even and deliberately so. The breathing of someone making herself be calm for the sake of the someone smaller leaning on her. I crouched down slow, a good way off. My eyes came round to the dark, and I could make her out, sitting against the wall with the boy half in her lap, and I could see the shape of the rifle, my rifle, laid across her knees. So she'd taken it after all, once she was inside, once I couldn't see. Of course she had. I'd have thought less of her if she hadn't. She'd sat in a stranger's dark house with his gun across her lap and listened to him lie to armed men through the wall, and she'd had no way to know which way the lie would fall until it had already fallen, and she'd held still through all of it with a child against her chest. I thought again of the sick room, of Marta not knowing my face, of myself standing there useless, and I thought, here is what it looks like to not be useless. Learn it. I didn't reach for the gun. I sat down on the floor across from them, my back to the cold stove's iron, and I let out a breath that seemed to have 3 days in it. They're gone, I said, to the dark, to no one who could understand the words, "It's all right, they're gone." And the boy, I thought he'd been asleep. The boy stirred and sat up out of his mother's lap, and in the dark I heard the small dry sound of the wooden quail being turned over and over in his hands, the habit already, the way I'd given it to him by accident an hour and a lifetime ago. He turned it over and over, and then he spoke. It was the first time I'd heard his voice, high and clear and unafraid now in the dark, where the men couldn't see him and the well water was in him and the gun was in his mother's hands and the world had narrowed down to a safe black room. He said a string of words in his own tongue, soft, a question by the shape of it, and his mother answered him low and there was a pause and then she did a thing that undid me. She translated. She had more English than she'd let on. Of course she had. You don't survive in a country trying to kill you by showing strangers the whole of what you can do. She said it carefully, putting the foreign words together one brick at a time, in a voice gone rough from the day. He asked why you cry before on the chair, a pause, when you make the bird. And I realized I had been. That afternoon, whittling with the boy crouched watching, I'd been crying the whole time and hadn't known it, the way you don't, 3 days in, when it's just become a thing your face does on its own, like breathing, like counting. The boy had seen. The boy had wanted to know why. And his mother, hunted, exhausted, sitting in the dark with a borrowed rifle and every reason on earth to think only of her own, had taken the trouble to ask the question for him, and to carry my answer back across the gap between us in a language that cost her something to use. I opened my mouth to answer him, to say something a grown man says. It's nothing, son, don't trouble yourself. The wall going back up brick by brick. And the boy spoke again before I could. 4 words this time. His mother started to translate and then stopped, because these 4 he'd saved up and learned to say himself, in my tongue, sometime in the long afternoon of watching me. 4 words he must have practiced under his breath the way children do, to give to me himself, his own small gift to set beside the wooden bird. 4 words. In the whole of the 3 days no one had asked me that. Think on it. Every soul who'd come up that wash, the preacher, the neighbors with their stew, Holloway who'd lost his own and so should have known, every one of them had known her name, and so not one of them had needed to ask it, and so not one of them had said it to me, because to them she was already a fact, a sad settled fact. Poor Marta Cade, dead of the fever, leaves the husband. They'd come to comfort the husband. None of them had come for her. Her name had gone into the ground with her on Saturday, and the world had simply closed over the top of it and moved on to the business of the living. And I had been drowning for 3 days in a grief I couldn't even name out loud, because no one had handed me the chance. And here was a hunted Apache boy in the dark of my house, a boy who had no reason on this earth to care, a boy whose people, my people, were at that very hour riding the country to kill, and he wanted to know her name, not to comfort me. He was too young for that. He wanted to know because he'd watched a man cry over a small wooden bird, and his child's heart had understood, in the clean, unclouded way children understand the things we spend our lives forgetting, that the crying had a who in it. That grief is always about a person. That somewhere behind my wet face was someone with a name, and that the name mattered, and that asking it was the realest thing he could offer. Marta, I said. And the dam went. I had not wept like that, not once, not even at the grave. At the grave I'd been a stone. Now I sat on my own floor in the dark with my back against a cold stove, and I said her name. Marta, her name was Marta. And then I was saying everything, all of it, the whole flood, in a language the boy mostly couldn't follow, and it didn't matter at all that he couldn't, because some things you have to say out loud to a living soul, and it matters more that the soul is living than that it understands the words. I told them about the nails and the fever and the 11 hours hard ride for a man with an empty bag. I told them about the windowsill of wooden birds and how she turned them all to face the same way, and I never asked why. I told them about the 2 that didn't hold and the empty rooms, and how I'd thought that was my whole grief and how wrong I'd been. I don't know how long I talked. The boy fell asleep against his mother somewhere in it. The dark was complete and kind. And when I finally ran dry, hollowed out and strangely light, the woman spoke, quiet, in her careful brick-by-brick English into the dark. She told me her name was, and I'll set it down the way she gave it to me, slow, like she was handing me something she didn't hand out Nady. Or near enough. I never got the shape of it perfect in my mouth, and she was kind about my trying. And the boy was her son, and his father was dead, not on any Bowie road. Her man had been dead a year, taken in a thing she didn't have the words for, and I didn't need them to understand. She told me they hadn't killed any teamster. They'd run because everyone was running, and to stay was to die slow on bad land. And she'd pointed her boy south toward kin she wasn't even sure were still alive, across a country with men like Prude in it, because a mother walks toward the chance and not away from it, every time, even when the chance is thin as a thread. And then she said the thing I have carried longest. She said it looking not at me but at her sleeping son, her hand moving in his hair. "You think," she said, "you have nothing now. I see it on the chair, a man who decide to stop." She let that sit, and I understood she'd read me from 30 paces that first morning, read the whole of it, the rifle and all, the same way I'd read the flat. "But you give water, you give bread, you put down the gun, you lie for us." She turned her head and found my eyes in the dark. "A man with nothing does not do these things. A man with nothing has nothing to give. You have much. You only forget where you put it. You only forget where you put it, like the rifle behind the door, like a name gone into the ground." We didn't sleep much. Before first light, while the dark still held, I filled a sack, what I could spare, and then more than I could spare, bread and bacon and a fold of dried beef, a tin cup, my old canteen, and a spare, a wool blanket that had been Marta's that I could not have given to a soul in that valley but gave to them without a second's grief, because it was finally going somewhere it would do some good. I drew them a map in the dirt by the stove door, the springs I knew, the wash that ran with water 2 months of the year, the high line where a body could see a patrol before the patrol saw it. I gave them my rifle. I want that written plain. I gave them my only rifle, and I have never for one day since wished I hadn't. And a man who knows this country will tell you what that gun was worth out here, and you can measure my heart by it if you like. She wouldn't take the rifle at first. I made her. I put it in her hands and closed her fingers on it the way she'd put the wooden bird in her boy's, and I said, "You've got a longer road than me." And whether she caught all the words, she caught the freight of them, and she stopped arguing. I walked them to the edge of my flat in the gray before dawn, to where the land tipped down toward the south country and the dark was just starting to thin off the far ridges. The boy was awake now, riding her hip heavy with sleep, the wooden quail still in his fist. He hadn't let go of it the whole night, I don't think. At the edge I stopped, because the edge was as far as I could go without leaving a grave untended, and we both knew it. Nady looked at me a long moment. Then she said one more thing, and it's the last of her words I'll give you. She said, "Marta," just the name. She said my wife's name back to me out loud to be sure I heard it spoken by another living person before they walked away, a gift, deliberate, the second greatest gift anyone gave me that week. Marta, she was real. Someone other than you has now said her name. And she turned and started down into the gray. The boy looked back at me over her shoulder. And he did the thing I have never told a living soul until now. He held up the wooden quail, held it up to the thin new light the way he had the afternoon before, the way Marta used to turn them on the sill, and then, small as he was, tired as he was, he set it down, on a flat rock at the edge of my flat. He left it there. He gave it back. Not because he didn't want it, I saw his face. He wanted it bad, but because a child who has nothing and is walking into nothing understands, better than any grown man, that you leave a gift where the grief is. So the grieving one isn't alone with it. He left me my bird on a rock at the edge of the world, and then he laid his head down on his mother's shoulder, and the two of them went down into the gray, and the distance took them. The way the desert takes everything, slow and then all at once. I never saw them again. I made my peace with not knowing a long time ago mostly. Some nights are harder than others. I went back and greased the windmill that morning, first thing. I figured I owed it. And then I went and sat by the cottonwood by Marta with the wooden quail in my hand, and I said her name out loud to her, which I had not been able to do for 3 days, and I told her about the boy. I told her a stranger's child had to come out of the desert and ask me 4 words before I could say her name, and I told her I was sorry it had taken me so long, and I told her, and this was the truth, I could feel it being the truth as I said it, that I was going to stand up now. That I'd found where I'd put it, that she could rest. The wooden birds are still on the windowsill. I turned them all to face the same way now. I finally know why she did it.